Welcome, everyone. And what a pleasure it is today to be a part of IoT World Cybersecurity Day. And today we're going to focus on a topic that the three of us are very passionate about. And just a little bit up front, I'm Rick Peters. I'm the CISO for operational technology for Fortinet, working and focusing my energy on North America. And today I'm joined by Dean Parsons. He is a critical infrastructure and ICS cybersecurity leader with the SANS Institute. And also joining us is Bruce Smell, the Vice President of Security Strategy and Transformation for NTT. Welcome, Dean and Bruce. Great to have the opportunity to chat today.
Yeah, super great to be here.
Happy to be here.
We're diving into a topic today that I know is of keen interest to many across the IT and OT industries. Today, for certain, OT infrastructure across manufacturing, energy utilities, transportation, and even arguably facility infrastructure, think smart buildings, cities, campuses, they're all becoming targets of sophisticated cyber attacks. Mm-hmm. And, we're going to dive into an inspection of what to do about that, readiness, and the theme of acknowledging that the likelihood is we're going to have to deal with it at some point. And so let's leverage our expertise and talk about our own perspectives and our experiences and our lessons learned. So we're going to start out by jumping right into the deep end of the pool. And I'm going to ask Bruce to respond and lead in on this one. Given the recent headlines, should OT asset owners approach cybersecurity as if they've already been breached?
Yeah, and I think that's generally a fairly good stance to take either on OT or IT. In fact, I don't know if you saw the news this morning, there was a company that is one of the major routers for SMS messaging just disclosed that they had been subject to a breach that has been going on for about 5 years, right? So, I think there's a lot of these attacks that, they kind of follow the slow and low methodology, right? Of getting in the background, kind of spreading out slowly so that they try to go unnoticed by, modern detection methodologies. So I think that a lot of organizations, probably already have breaches that have taken place and are really just kind of waiting to, explode, right? Or waiting for something to get noticed. So I think the safe stance is to really just go into any sort of OT security program, even if, maybe you're starting one up or maybe you're reevaluating your program. You should really go into that with the concept that you've already been breached and that the attack may come from either outside or most likely coming from somewhere inside.
Excellent. Dean, would you like to comment?
Yeah, great points there. I think we're all seeing the headlines, whether in IT or industrial controls, and at many levels, at the technical level or CISOs, for example, at the C-level and engineering VPs seeing the headlines as well. I think what's important to note about the headlines is that they're exactly that. I think that they are headlines. And so preparing for that you've probably been breached or you could be breached is a smart thing to do, but use the headlines to just bring awareness to the sectors that we are seeing breaches in and impacts in. But using and leveraging threat intelligence specifically to your sector, I think is the right approach that's going to give you the most return of investment. So understanding what has happened in your sector the last 6 months, 2 months, 3 years, learning about how those attacks come about, specifically the vectors, and then hopefully we'll get into it later, but really working your way back from what you've seen through headlines and actual threat intelligence to build up incident response strategies or tabletops as an example as well. So in short, yeah, it's an absolutely good idea to understand that you could be breached already or you're potentially targeted. Beyond the specific targeted attacks that we are seeing, adversaries have campaigns, which are not necessarily just targeting 1 or 2 organizations in oil and gas, and then next week targeting the electric sector. You could be part of the net that the adversary casts, and you could get impacted that way, not necessarily directly targeted, but some kind of collateral damage as well. So for sure.
Yeah, Dean, you bring up a good point. I think, we kind of overlook the concept of secondary and tertiary targets, right? Attacking people on the supply chain, as it were. in order to get to your primary target. So I think that's a really great point to bring up, is that you may not be the end target, but you could end up being collateral damage of some sort of attack.
Yeah, and we have seen the adversary use third-party kind of partnerships, as an example, compromise the weakest link that's connected to an organization, such as an integrator that may have low security, to get access to that primary target, so up through that chain.
You know, it's interesting. I'm listening to you both, and I'm smiling inside because you're speaking my language here, because I know what we're up against. And I think one of the themes that underpins everything you've just talked about is it's all about readiness. You know, making sure you've been thoughtful in building response plans that have been exercised. And you're right, there, you know, we see headlines out there often exaggerated or sensationalized. Certainly the public responds, and that's part of a successful campaign today. I love the fact that I think it was Bruce, you pointed out that there's an instance of a 5-year period of low and slow, even reconnaissance. And I think that's something that those of us who've been in the business for a while understand what that kill chain looks like. You know, from the point of accomplishing reconnaissance to getting on target to doing privilege escalation, we have to be resilient across that chain. And today we're thinking dimensionally to try and outmaneuver that adversary. And that requires a great deal of proactivity. So I'm excited about what I'm seeing across the industry, because we're tuning into the fact that, yep, it's probably going to happen, has happened, or is happening. Let's get on with being able to detect and neutralize what's going on without having to be a demonstrable event in our company's history or in our industry's history. And so I think that's an important point. And so proactivity, I think, is one of the key themes as we think about this. You know, as we dive deeper into the topic today, it's also great to learn a little bit about who our audience is and their disposition. And we'd like to do a first poll, and that's going to require your interactivity, please. And our first poll is coming up, and it really is: how prepared are you to defend against an advanced persistent threat that could impact critical operations in your industrial control system? So 5 pretty easy answers. Hey, I'm not prepared at all. Somewhat are not prepared. Hey, somewhere in the middle, not real sure. Again, maybe a little bit better, but still knowing there's some ceiling room, and then really feeling as if you're prepared. So looking for some responses here. Dean and Bruce, prior to seeing that, do you have some suspicion as to the landscape here and the kind of responses we're going to see?
I'm going to go on a limb here and predict that we're becoming more and more prepared. I think that in general, headlines help, again, draw people's attention to this, which is good. I'm really hoping to see, 4 and 5, right? Somewhat prepared, proactively, right? Prepared and prepared. That's what I'm wishing to see here. And by prepared, I really mean that active defense, right? Understanding that not just passive defenses are going to help here, but looking through the network, which I'm sure we'll get into. That's my prediction, but I'll pass it over to Bruce and his thoughts.
Yeah, I don't want to influence the numbers here. Thankfully we don't have money riding on it, but it's interesting to see, the kind of the progression of preparation, right? I mean, I remember, speaking at IoT or OT conferences, 5 or 6 years ago, and I was one of the only security talk tracks, right? And then now you see the conferences starting to focus more on security. So I think from an industry perspective, we're moving more towards the somewhat prepared, right? Versus, even just 5-6 years ago, it was maybe somewhat not prepared, right?
So I was hoping, there we go. So we're seeing the data come up, and it really is a pretty good centralized distribution there. I think awareness is there, as you both suggested. It's top of mind today. I think that's my experience working with customers across the OT subsector verticals, is keenly aware and trying to determine where can they best invest to advance their state of readiness. Very few that I'm working with are folding their arms and feeling as if they've accomplished all the steps they need to be truly resilient. And in fact, I think the business that we're in right now, I don't think you ever quite get there, because the cyber adversary continues to add to their tradecraft, adding to their techniques and opportunities against an attack surface that continues to grow. So I think it's a pursuit, right? It's investing, elevating attention, to get to the point of having readiness that says when that event occurs, I'm going to be able to prosecute a defense proactively that allows me to minimize the impact and sustain safe and continuous business, which of course, in operational technology is the abiding principle for business. So that's awesome. All right, we're going to jump into our second question, and I'm going to let Dean lead in on this one, please. What bad actors and breaches have the potential for the greatest impact on OT assets? And what are the most common attack vectors used to gain access to those industrial systems?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start off with what are the greatest impacts? Well, we've seen the attempt at what I would consider the greatest impacts already just a couple of years ago, which is likely being expanded upon, and that's the Trisis malware targeting safety controllers, so safety instrumented systems, in this case, oil and gas sector. However, that type of attack can be expanded or scaled to other types of environments as well. So the biggest impacts for sure would be safety, loss of life, which really the idea behind the creation and execution of the Trisis specific ICS malware is to do that, take out safety systems, harm and kill people. So that's the potential impacts we're seeing from a safety perspective. Now, if we talk about the different vectors, the common vectors that we're seeing, there's like a handful that are like, we're seeing them time and time again because they still work. And this is not just, oh, it's coming in through email, it's a phishing scam. It goes well beyond that. And looking at the numbers from the 2021 SANS ICS survey, we're seeing nearly 19%, just over 18% of the initial attack vectors being leveraged on the engineering workstation. So the industrial control device that's used to program these safety instrumented systems, PLCs, RTUs in the field. So for sure, that is one attack vector in. Now, email for sure is still a vector that can get the adversary in, usually in the IT environment. And then the other vector we see the adversary use from the IT environment is pivoting through that trusted machine or devices that we have, which is the data historian servers, and pivoting into the ICS. So in short, we're really seeing the engineering workstation, a critical asset being targeted and as an initial attack vector, IT being leveraged to get a foothold, and then pivoting into the ICS as well. And I don't want to forget the idea of a transient device that is a USB stick or a laptop that can literally walk right through your physical controls, walk right past your firewalls, your intrusion detection systems, and plug into a device. That could be from a physical break-in at a plant, for example, remote site and generation facility, transmission facility, and then plugging directly in. Or it could be a contractor or an integrator coming in unbeknownst to them, having a contaminated laptop plugging in as well. So those are the top 2 or 3 that we're seeing. There are others as well. And direct access to the HMI, if your industrial control system has access to the internet, is also something that we're seeing. So those are a few in there that can help determine what we can kind of work our way back from to build up a defense.
Yeah, I just picked up a comment from Paul Cummings. Like to get your own, to both of your insight on this one. He says, hey, insider threat, I fear will never go down in numbers. Thoughts on that, Bruce?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty accurate assessment, and I think you really have to think about insider threats in two different ways, right? There's insider threats that are intentional, and then there's insider threats that are unintentional, right? And I think the unintentional insider threats are going to continue to grow. As the adversaries start getting more crafty, if that's possible, right? They're already pretty crafty as it is. But as they start breaching out into realizing, and especially when you combine it with a lot of the more people working from home more these days, so the last couple of years that we've been into, you're seeing more lax security, unintentionally lax security from remote workers, which can then in turn end up being insider threats, right? Even though technically they're not maliciously doing it by themselves, they're letting that adversary in. And so I think that's an area where the insider threats are going to continue to grow.
Excellent. Dean, thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking in the back of my mind as we're all speaking through this, and with the great questions coming in, how does one prepare? Going back to the poll, there's 28%, which is the highest number in that poll, that are so on their preparedness. So readiness from this perspective to identify anomalous activity from insider threats, to identify something strange and adversary pivoting into the environment. The readiness piece is going to be really all about that, preparing the network visibility, looking at the network, knowing what is strange or odd about it, and that will require specific training for ICS environments and understanding their control system as well. So I keep going back to readiness and really having the visibility in the control network to determine what is malicious, to head it off before it actually has an impact.
Yeah, I
I know
think
we're going to
visibility is
go
a,
ahead. Go
oh,
ahead,
sorry,
Bruce.
Rick.
No, go ahead, Bruce,
I
please.
just want to follow up on what Dean was saying. I think visibility is a huge thing that we really need to focus on, right? Because, as we know, there are a lot of environments in the OT side or the ICS side that you can't do active blocking, right? You don't want to be, actively blocking connectivity, either because it's, letting, pushing through productivity numbers, helping with reordering, helping with, logistics, or, in the instance of a SIS system, right, where it's making, letting you know that something's on fire, right? So there's a lot of defenses that really have to be more passive. And I think that's where that visibility comes into play, right? Where we have to really start focusing on, maybe it almost seems like a little bit of an older methodology, but we really have to start focusing on those eyes on glass to make sure and watch out for new and anomalous behavior, that we can't rely on systems to actively block, automatically, like from an EDR perspective. I mean, within reason, right?
It's interesting. You both have brought up a topic that resonated with me back a couple of years ago, because I thought the ability to get into the kinetic or the sabotage zone for a cyber attack was interesting, because it again illustrated, and Trisus Triton was a perfect example of that, the ability to get on and affect the safety instrumentation system. It creates a volatility that I think was, it was a watershed event, right, for OT, because it brought to the attention the ability to penetrate and affect change in a space that I think many felt was insulated historically, because you had air gaps as ways to protect. But we know that today in 2021, in fact, for the last few years, there's always been a way to get on target if the adversary was persistent enough. And I like to think about characterizing these attacks as having different levels of engagement and intent, right, from extortion, which has become wildly popular, right, through ransomware campaigns. But I think a lot of what goes on really is about espionage, industrial espionage, being able to get onto the target and be able to exfiltrate your intellectual property, because I think that's where the money really gets made. Certainly, though, we have to understand the complete range of consequence, right, all the way to the effect of threatening human life. And of course, that's across many of our small and large industries today. So I think the stakes are high in the game. I think we certainly have made our audience today aware of that. I want to move on to our next question. And I'm going to ask Bruce to lead in on this one, please. Now, how should OT asset owners approach readiness when building their response strategy for an ICS cyber incident?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think, when you start looking at readiness, we need to really expand beyond just the ICS network and just the OT network, right? Because everything is connected, right? We've got interconnectivity, and I've seen network infrastructure that is very well isolated, very well segmented, really good segmentation. But I've also seen extremely flat networks where somebody from HR can directly access an HMI, if they had the login, right? And so I think when you start looking at the readiness for building a response strategy, you need to make sure that you're taking into account the whole of the business, right? The holistic aspect of it. Your OT assets, for sure, but then also making sure that you're tied in with IT, right? And that the IT team is working, IT security team is working with you on strategy and making sure that that's all included. because that's going to be key, right? Because we're seeing so many attacks that come from the IT side into OT. There could be potentially vice versa, right? Could be the other side going out. But I think the first thing to really start looking at when you're looking at readiness is that connectivity between the two environments, right? Because I think I've been in a lot of environments where the OT and the IT teams are separate camps, right? And are kind of, they don't have the closest relationship. That I'm trying to be politically correct about it, but it's like there's a lot of organizations where the OT team says don't touch my stuff because last time you came in here you ran a scan and took 10 of my machines offline, right? And so there has to be that trust and that interconnected relationship between IT and OT when you're building out this response strategy.
It's interesting. I love the fact that we've talked about the whole of business and the need to coordinate, right? Because we understand the difference in the value systems that are held long and true by our IT subject matter experts who feel like they have a good handle on the cybersecurity best practices. But again, we have to respect that which is unique in operational technology. You can't take some of the same approaches, right? The active scans and such will affect a very fragile environment as you get closer to the plant floor, to use that analogy. And so we can't be knocking over PLCs and RTUs in an attempt to try and understand what's going on. So I think there has to be a healthy respect for that. I like to think of three dimensions that we need to provision across that transom of IT and OT. And that is, designing it with transparency, because I think, Bruce, you already pointed out, and I believe Dina did as well, continuity in business is key in operational technology. Safe, continuous operations is measured in time, and lost time is money, is revenue. So as you design security features, techniques, capabilities into your environment, you have to do it with transparency so that you're not incurring latency as you accomplish that. I think the other thing that's key in this environment is you have to think about scalability. Our environment today is changing. I know we're going to dive a little deeper in that in a minute, but the scope in terms of the number of enabled devices that we're touching today continues to grow exponentially. And so whatever we're doing in the solution space needs to scale with that. And of course, the absolution of all of that is we better be doing cutting edge technology kinds of things that allow us to prosecute this active defense or proactive defense at the speed of business, because you're otherwise chasing instead of leading. And I think that's very important if we're going to outmaneuver the adversary. One final point I would add into this, because I think it's important, and I think we've been talking about it without saying it, it really is consequence engineering, right? If we understand the risk and the vulnerabilities that are posed to our environment, we can then determine the likelihood of an attack and the consequence of that. And I think, proportionally speaking, we have to understand not just the impact, but our readiness to defend. And today, that's a dollars and cents issue when we're wrestling with our executives that we're trying to convince to make the investment. So it's, we've got all these dimensions happening at once, but I think it's important to recognize that, again, the stakes are high, but our failure to act is a consequence in and of itself. So I think it's important that we lead the charge and insist that partnership and collaboration across this community becomes a part of how we think and behave, because that's going to allow us to accomplish a great deal more. Hey, I'm gonna shift to Dean now and ask our next question. Regular incident response tabletop exercises are part of a mature ICS security program, and it works to identify strong and weak points in your ICS defense efforts. What are the top 2 or 3 scenarios you would advise OT asset owners to prepare for, and why?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm going to start off by saying, readiness. How do you prepare? Obviously, a tabletop is going to give you that high return of investment. So to Bruce's point earlier, what does a tabletop give you? To Bruce's point, it allows those teams to kind of get together, to work together. Right now, readiness for ICS security is not take IT security and paste it into the ICS. When you do that, you will have outages, you will have issues. And here's the thing that I see as a myth in the industry still. Network visibility is going to be critical. But if you look at the industrial control system network, we know segmentation is critical. So following Purdue, for example, critical, something of that nature to have segmented zones, enforcement boundaries. Now, when I look at it from a lot of IT folks coming into ICS, they have an understanding that, well, it's just really Windows systems pushing bits around, making things happen in the engineering world. But really, if you look at the stack of the Purdue model, the upper 10, 20, maybe 25% are traditional operating systems that can be utilized to help with the operations. Those controls that we could put on those devices may be similar to the IT security controls, but not quite. But everything below that 25% is embedded systems, devices, engineering controllers, meters, and those things. So that's really not, I would call an IT asset at all. So very, very different security needs to happen at that lower level. So back to the top, I would say tabletops we could utilize, have something that's a threat-driven kind of approach. So understanding what threats are out there. What have we seen in your sector? And a really good example of that is ransomware on the IT network. Does that impact your ICS? From a logistics perspective, we've seen it with Colonial, whereby there was a shutdown to preserve and make sure safe the OT environment was still safe, but there was issues with access to logistics and billing systems on the IT network. So one of the top three I'll mention tabletops would be, if you have something in the IT network that prevents you from doing something in the ICS, what would that look like? So it would involve IT at the table, security from ICS at the table, safety as well at the table, and kind of work back from there. What dependencies do you have on IT? If we look at another type of scenario for a tabletop, I really highly recommend kind of running this through your environment. What about direct access to control environments? So direct access to the HMI. We've seen it time and time again where no malware is used in the control environment. Malware may be used on IT to get a foothold, pivot into ICS, and then in the ICS, the adversaries are constantly living off the land. So they're getting access through remote devices to the human machine interface to directly manipulate and change the process, just as an operator would. And legitimately, they can do that as an operator, but using it for nefarious purposes. So shutting down power to a region, for example, increasing the level of chemicals in a wastewater management facility, which we've seen earlier this year as well. So running the scenario of if an adversary can get access directly to the HMI, what could the impact be? In those discussions, again, in all of these scenarios, have security at the table, the physical security safety team as well, of course, your engineers and operators in IT security, depending on how you divvy up security in your organization. So those are the top two tabletops. I do have another one as well, and this one is dependent on your how dispersed your operations are. So I'm from the electric sector and the oil and gas sector. We have a lot of remote sites, as you may have in your environment as well. So running a tabletop of if an adversary or group gets access to a remote site, physically kicking doors in, for example, can they directly plug into those sites and then come upstream into your environment, for example, or impact something at that remote site that will ultimately impact your environment? So those are the top three. And I have a whole bunch more, but those are the top three I think would be really good to Bruce's point earlier, get those needed teams together, the engineers, security teams, operators talking about this stuff. And tabletops are a great return of investment because you don't need technology. You need to understand your environment. So there's no go buy $1 million solution at this point. It's understanding what you have, where are your gaps. And if these solutions or if these tabletops are not going to fit in your organization for some reason, look to the assessments you've recently done. Look to the audits you've recently done, find those gaps, and make a scenario around those to kind of drive your investment.
You know, before I turn to Bruce and ask for his comment, you illuminated a point to me, Dean, that I've heard a couple of times through this year, and that is when you're thinking through these thoughtful tabletop exercises, designing readiness, very important to have your engineering expertise at the table. It's not enough to think that somehow you can model it without those who best understand the functionality of the environment. They have an intuition for how things are connected and the behaviors that you're going to see. We can talk a lot about containment strategies, but the reality is we have to go through all the scenarios, right? And be able to understand what's going on behavioral. We'll explore that in a minute. But Bruce, would you like to offer a comment?
Yeah, I think, Dean made fantastic points. And I think, I definitely agree with, his exercises. And the kind of the people that we need to bring to the table. I would add an additional layer that I think we kind of lose track of, because I'm guilty of this as well, where you start just focusing on the engineering side and the technology side. But we also have to make sure that, especially if you're a larger organization, that you start bringing in, your PR team, your marketing folks, right? So that when a breach does happen, that any information being, announced is, I don't want to say controlled or censored, but more so that the actual information gets out instead of a bunch of hearsay, right? Because, when we start looking at things like, Colonial is a great example when it turned into fistfights at gas pumps, right? Because people didn't know. So when we're dealing with critical infrastructure, we need to make sure also that, not only do we have the ability to make sure that the business continuity is in line and that everything is going to, get up to speed and back and running and quickly and safely, but we also have to make sure that the impact that happens on the outside is more measured and is accurate, right? Because it's, especially in the modern day that we live in with social media, et cetera, a rumor can spread very quickly and people can start panicking, right? So when we're dealing with critical infrastructure, power, gas, things that people depend on for their daily life, we need to make sure that you have some sort of plan in place to let people know outside, let your customers know, let the people impacted know what's going on and what steps you're taking to bring things back to normalcy.
If I could just point out one thing that so Rick mentioned earlier, having the engineers there, that's critical. So I've built teams for IT, I've built teams for OT and converged teams, et cetera. And what I find in IT, the typical scenario is there's a system infected, take it off the wire. If you're mature enough, you kind of sample the memory, you all of these things to get IOCs, a scope. In OT, in ICS, it's not take a box off the wire, patch it, put it back in production. You could literally be weeks or months fighting through an attack, containing an attack to make sure that operations still remain up, that malware, that threat is contained, but that box is still up, producing electricity, monitoring oil and gas pipeline, all of those kinds of things. So engineering needs to be at the table to understand when security suggests, not pulling wires, but they suggest opportunities for the industrial control systems, then the engineers say, okay, that would make sense, but that doesn't make sense. That's going to be $1 million a minute or a day, or that's going to kill somebody. So having that nuanced discussion, engineers at the table, critical. When I build teams in ICS, it's not to take systems offline, it's to present opportunities and options to the engineering VP that says, here's what we could do. What do you want to do? It's your plant. From a cybersecurity perspective, here's the potential impact we see. Here's where the threat is going. Here's how we're containing it. And one last point on what Bruce mentioned about Colonial. In the oil and gas sector, I was in the oil and gas sector and I did assessments during that time frame, and we literally dropped everything. Colonial happened. We took exactly what we know about that from the threat intelligence in the days that it became what it became, and we ran that as a tabletop in our environment, like stopped everything and focused. So when you do see things in your sector that come up, great opportunities to take that, push it in your environment. How would that impact us, right? And then go along with the information and threat element that comes out. Huge advantages with finding logging gaps, as an example. Oh, we didn't have a team member there looking at this when we thought we did. We don't have enough engineers to do that. Okay, all these other gaps, which cannot just be technical gaps, kind of fall out of that. So a lot of value. Can't say enough about tabletops.
I think another angle that's important, and it falls in line with the comments that Dean, you've been sharing, and Bruce as well, and that is the survivability of the OT environment dependent upon the IT enterprise. And you've mentioned the oil and gas incident, and that was a great illustration of that, right? The IT enterprise was affected, the collateral effect or impact was it necessitated a short-term shutdown of the pipeline. And of course, the other point which you both have talked about is the sensationalized headlines that our consumers digest on the open source. When I was confronted early on in that particular event, someone asked me, what do you do in these situations? I said, I turn to my analysts. They're the ones who are deconflicting intelligence. They understand the extent of what's going on. They understand the CVEs that may be brought into play and our ability to be ready and resilient to defend against that, because you would expect to see repeat campaigns to try and take advantage of what has worked. So I think that's important, but I think survivability today and the continuity of operations, and certainly as you're thinking about tabletop operations, you got to think about the impact of IT to OT and vice versa, because often OT may not be the primary point of engagement for the attack, but collaterally speaking, eventually the adversary either finds their way onto the target through a masquerade or some other technique. But the point is, it may impact the OT environment without ever actually touching it. So, was that a successful campaign? Absolutely. In fact, the impact extended beyond the service range of that particular industry. So again, there's a whole lot at stake when we're involved in trying to defend these at the speed of business. And I think that becomes very important as well. I'd like to take an opportunity to take on the second poll question of the day. So we'll wait for that to pop onto the screen right now. And I'll introduce it by saying it's really now a chance to think about your own businesses. And can you operate industrial controls in an isolated situation when IT may have been compromised? What we just talked about. So this is thoughtful, right? And the answers are pretty straightforward. Yep, we've thought about this. Or yeah, we think we have a partial solution, or no, we have an issue, or we're really not sure. Guys, you think you have a sense of how our audience might answer this?
Well, I'm going to go partially, right? Because I think, I'm seeing a lot of organizations that, have good segmentation, right? And can run as independent networks. But, I think you can also lean on, on the side of caution, like similar to what happened with Colonial, where, when there's impact, do you voluntarily shut down the ICS side, right?
So I think that in the Colonial event was a very interesting one because it was ransomware. Early on, the triage indicated it was ransomware targeting IT assets, Windows traditional assets, we'll call it. Mm-hmm. In some cases in the electric sector, you can completely continue to generate electricity, transmit electricity, and distribute electricity without a Windows box. And you can do that by HMIs embedded at the plant floor, which means you can still operate OT in the electric sector in some cases, depending, with your Windows systems, even HMIs at the engineering level or operators level being unavailable. And so I think with regards to the outcome of this poll, I do think we'll see some partial as well. You might also see, unknown, or, hey, yes, I can, but only for 3 days. I'm an oil and gas industry and I have a refinery. I can refine and I can produce refined fuels and I can store those in my tanks. But once those tanks are filled and I have no one to ship it to, or I can't build them for it, it's going to stay in those tanks. So maybe there's a logistical kind of reason to shut down your oil and gas facility or refinery facility, but maybe you can still produce and keep OT running while IT is impacted and they're kind of restoring to a resilient and trusted point. And then you can kind of continue on from there. So I think this is going to be all over the map. And I think that it depends on, it depends on the industry. I would like to see isolation wherever possible, at least to maintain safety. And I think the positive from the Colonial event was they maintained safety. They shut down in a controlled manner. And that was positive.
In fact, what's interesting, and I'm anxious to see the answers myself, what's interesting is in that particular scenario, right, they did have a good understanding of what the return to normal business is going to look like. Look at that, partially leading the way. So, we're not prognosticators, but I think we have a good sense of what the community looks like out there. But there's a lot of work to do. I think we knew that going in. I know when I'm working with executives and boards today, everyone's thinking about it. If they haven't been directly impacted, they're asking themselves, well, what if that was me? Which is great, right? They're posturing and putting themselves on the hot seat, if you will. And I think that's the right strategy to take as you're moving forward. So it's encouraging, I think, to see that our community writ large is moving in the right direction. And certainly no one's sitting back saying, I'm not going to worry about being that needle in the haystack, because obviously that gets you nothing but trouble. Right. So I'm going to move on, and I'm actually going to lead on this next question. And it is talking about some key takeaways for practical ICS defense. And I'm going to highlight some critical ICS assets that could be commonly targeted, right? And should be highly monitored and protected. And this takes me into the zone of wanting to express. Start by knowing your own. If you're thinking about a takeaway, you really have to understand where your most valuable assets are, how they represented, and how they looked upon as targets, because that's exactly what they are. Those assets, whether you're talking about the physical plant, whether you're talking about the intellectual property, your crown jewels, your recipes, your trade secrets, whatever it is, that's the information that in my history, if I'm on target, that's what I'm trying to accomplish. I'm going to probably have a number of collateral effects. In fact, I might suggest that ransomware is my calling card that I'm going to leave when I'm done. But chances are I'm seeking to find my way into your environment and profit from it, because that's a big motivation today. And then secondly, I think it's important to think inside out. And we can talk about the importance of hardening the edge and doing all of those things, but it really is understanding behaviorally what's going on within your domain. The idea of behavioral analysis and analytics is becoming more and more a part of the growth and the solution of an ecosystem that's designed to think beyond just visibility and segmentation, and getting into something that's a bit more proactive and that's industrial related. At this point, I'll turn to Dean. You have thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, so great points there. There's a couple things. I think before I talk about what I think is our targeted asset, what threat intelligence, not my opinion, but what threat intelligence leads us to think targeted assets are, I think the takeaways for writing this is avoid copy and pasting IT security into the ICS. Obviously, I'm a fan of running threat intel or consequence-driven tabletop exercises. We know that the human-machine interface is targeted. Engineering workstation, the same thing, the ability for the adversary to reprogram the plant floor, and also the data historian. Now, a lot of folks think, well, we're segmented, which is great, but the data historian we're not going to see connections coming from IT through the data historian. Okay, that's great. However, we still see the data historian being targeted because it has sensitive data. So for example, if you're a manufacturer of vaccines, for example, and your recipe for a vaccine is stored in that data historian, which it will be, then that's sensitive information that the adversary will absolutely target and glean off, maybe not even from the ICS environment. So they can learn about the process that way as well. I guess the top three things for writing this, just from where we are in the conversation, would be absolute network segmentation. So that's not only just IT and OT and the internet, it's treating the internet and IT as hostile environments, but also having process zones, enabled in your control environment. And that's a prerequisite for the next point, which is specific network visibility, having ICS specific intrusion detection systems that understand the industrial protocols, the MP3, Modbus, all of those. And then building on that, because when you have visibility, you're going to find things, having a specific intrusion detection and response plan that includes safety and engineering folks as well. Those would be the top three things, but I have about 348 after that. But
Bruce, would you like to comment?
Yeah, you guys have both brought up some really good points. So it's hard to find things that you guys didn't cover that will be salient. But one of the things that I really run into quite a bit is looking at specifically around the HMIs, when you may have them running very old versions of Windows, right? I mean, we're talking, Windows 95 or XP, et cetera. And then the problem that I think a lot of people run into is that then there's not, up-to-date security tools that can work easily on those environments, right? You may have to run an old version of an AV software because the current version isn't supported, right? This is something I've run into with clients specifically. So I think we need to take a really special look from from the security perspective around those assets, right? So not just obviously we can't cut and paste an IT security policy into the OT side, right, or the ICS side, because they're such different animals. But we really have to take a look at the things that are up to date, right? The HMIs, historians, et cetera, that may have older operating systems that we have to deal with. And I think a lot of people approach the security process as prevention versus mitigation, right? I always like to lead in with a mitigation strategy versus a prevention strategy, because there are going to be things you can't patch, right? There's going to be systems out there that maybe your next maintenance window is 6 months from now, right? And there's a hot vulnerability, right? So there has to be this kind of scaffolding, if you will, of security controls in place that can really help mitigate those issues that you'll run into. There's vulnerabilities out there, on modern ICS equipment that we don't know about, right? And you look at, if you look at the kind of the graph of discoveries of vulnerabilities in the ICS world, it kind of looks like a hockey stick, right? I mean, there was nothing for a while, and then Stuxnet and some of the others start being raised, and suddenly the vulnerabilities increase, right? It's not that there are new vulnerabilities; those vulnerabilities have existed. Nobody just paid attention to it, right? So there are a lot of issues out there where we just have to put a good enough mitigation strategy in place, because there's going to be things that we can't patch and things that we don't know that we need to patch.
You make some excellent points, Bruce. We are well aware that across operational technology, and even going to Dean's point, it's cross-cutting, right? Even into healthcare and life sciences, we find a necessity of understanding how the impacts can affect and go beyond just what we might think of as traditionally OT. But then that in of itself, the reality is the majority of the infrastructure is not green space. It's
right.
A lot of legacy hardware and software. It's not unusual to encounter an XP-based environment out there, and somebody be thinking in the IT, that's impossible, not an OT.
Yeah. And
in fact, when we think about our infrastructure and our solutions, again, we talked earlier about being transparent. Transparent also includes supporting and being backwards compatible for generations, likely. And that will continue to be a challenge, right? Because that becomes another way to get onto the target. Certainly, using legacy techniques that have worked well in IT historically but been neutralized is another way to get into the environment. So that's a reality. That's what we face today. I want to move on to our final question, and I'm going to let Bruce lead in on this one, please. What best practice guidance would you give OT leaders when taking the first steps to restart a cybersecurity program, or it could even be to start a new one?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know I touched on it earlier, but I think I can't emphasize enough the importance of kind of extending the hands across the wall, right, from IT to OT, right, because the two sides are so interconnected in ways that we may not even realize, right. So it's really extremely important to make sure that you have that cross-pollination when you're starting to build out this strategy, right? Another is to also make sure that the folks with the budget understand, right? Because ultimately we have to, as a security practitioner, you have to ask for budget, right? You have to make sure that you're properly budgeted so that you can have the proper tools in place, the proper staff. Which is becoming, from a staffing perspective, it's becoming even more difficult because, we're just in the IT security space, there's 4 million open jobs in security because there just aren't the people out there to staff them, right? So then you need to start looking at, who can you partner with, right? Are there folks or organizations out there that you can reach out to supplement your security teams, right? Those are key points to look into. And one thing that I think is overlooked a lot is, especially when you look at manufacturing, engineering, you have all of these costs that are, there's a standard progression of cost, right? The materials are always going to, increase in cost year over year. Hopefully your customers are going to increase year over year. There's all of these increases, but I think not enough people on the board are looking at the increase in attacks, right? If we look historically, I mean, you can look at any chart, you're going to see a huge increase year over year of new attacks, right? New attacks against IT, new attacks against ICS, new attacks against OT, IoT. So those are some things that I think we should make sure that we're planning in for, is that increase in the threat landscape. And I think that's one that's really overlooked quite a bit.
Excellent point. Dean, your thoughts?
Yeah, great points there for sure, Bruce. I think from a technical perspective, what can guide a defense team in ICS is something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, the ICS version. I think that leveraging that in a technical perspective will give you an understanding of, well, what actual coverage do I have against the known threats that we've been tracking for years, and what could potentially happen if I don't have that coverage. Coverage being at least visibility on the network I keep going back to, but also things like construction nearby here, but also things like beyond the network segmentation, having the understanding of what controls could be in place. What network segmentation do I have, access controls being used on the firewall, those kinds of things. So I'd really use that kind of practical guidance for the technical defenders. And looking at it from a higher level perspective, risk management as a whole, really going back to understanding what the risk is there. So consequence driven decisions, consequence driven budgets as well, right? What's the risk in IT? A bad day is loss of data, applications are done, and that's not a good thing. Consequences in ICS is, again, safety aspect, working back from that. What controls should I have in place? What don't I have in place? And then focusing on that, allowing threat intelligence, not necessarily headlines, but threat intel to drive you what's important. Protecting those critical assets we talked about earlier, and Rick pointed out as well, the HMI, for example, engineering workstation, et cetera. And then taking, I would suggest, I'm totally biased here, but an ICS specific security approach to industrial control systems.
I'm gonna foot stomp and say, wow, you guys are on point. And I'm gonna add a couple of additional points that I think could be missed. They're a little, I'll call them non-technical, but they're abiding principles. I think most industries today, most OT leaders have taken on a framework. If you haven't, adopt a framework, because that enables you an ability to identify and break down how you solve the problem, to identify your gaps and pain points. And whether you choose IE 62443 or NIST cybersecurity framework or any number of them, it's a thoughtful approach, right? It allows you to be a little more granular and how you know your own, as we talked about that earlier. And the other point I'd like to make here is that cybersecurity maturity really is a multi-dimensional challenge. It's not just technology. Certainly that's a huge part, because it's a force multiplier, because as Bruce already pointed out, we can't solve it with bodies. That's not going to be our force multiplier. So we try and bring to the game for operational technology sophistication that enables the operator, right? Fuse actionable intelligence, the data, the information that allows them to pivot and make smart decisions in the moment to sustain safe and continuous business. But I think there's also a need to focus on people. We certainly learned that over the last 2 years, right? With all the innovation that occurred, the need to educate our workforces and kind of pivot from being a liability to an asset through awareness, and really continue to drive that campaign that everybody has a stake in the success of the business has been more important than ever. And then understanding your operational processes, and again, how that crosses the domain from IT to OT and that transom. That's important. And then a final one, I just want to feather this one in here. You guys have both talked about the need for collaboration. I mean, security in this business space, it is a team sport. And I know 4 years ago when I transitioned from the intelligence community to the commercial world, what attracted me was this notion of technology alliances, working collaboratively and understanding that no single entity has the solution to the problem, And taking an ecosystem approach and building these technology alliances allows you to work with customers, allows you to work with executives and help them understand that they may be farther along in their journey than they thought, and they can repurpose or leverage the technology they already have to get a better return on investment as they're improving their overall environment. You know, we're approaching the top of the hour. I think it's only prudent to allow each of you to give a final thought before we close out. Bruce, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I want to be cognizant of time because I could go on for a while, but I think one of the things that we need to make sure is that, you know, everybody is involved in security, right? Security needs to be part of the culture of an organization. If you have, you know, 5,000 employees, you should have 5,000 people on your security team, right? I think the human element is really, if we kind of boil it down, is really a leading cause in a lot of these breaches, right? And so if everybody from the security guard at the front desk to, you know, the people in HR are thinking about security and regularly quizzed on security with phishing campaigns, things like that, that's going to go a long way to making sure that everybody is safe.
Excellent. How about you, Dean?
Yeah, just being aware of time here, we get lots of questions and comments in the chat, which is great. I want to choose to address one of those as the last comment. And the question is really around, can you have ICS defenders from IT security kind of coming over to the dark side? Yes, absolutely you can. My suggestion is to make sure they first understand the industrial control system. So here's what I've done in the past that I have found worked with for my teams that I've built. I literally get them from the engineering staff into my team, also from IT. And the first thing I do, like first day on the job in ICS security, we go to site. Hard hats on, knee pads on, eyewear on, all that stuff. We walk through the plant. And before we go in, it's like, cool, so what controls do you want to put in the plant? And they're like, encryption, encrypt the network, do this, endpoint, all that stuff. And that's great. And then after the other side, when you exit the plant, it's like, okay, we need to take a different approach. And so, yes, the resources for ICS security can come from anywhere, but I would advise getting those resources to the physical site, walk them through the actual plant, and they can quickly get an understanding of what bad can happen if you drop a packet, i.e. an IT security intrusion prevention system dropping packets is never a good thing, as Bruce mentioned earlier. And that's a great way to get your security team never back into a plant again to do security. Right. So hopefully that helps.
You know, this has been a fascinating journey over the last hour. I really appreciate your thought leadership and your insights, because this is how we work as a community. It's how we raise the bar, right, to protect operational technology. Certainly, where there's a whole lot of initiative underway. We know that over the last 6 to 8 months, right, we've seen a lot federally, really upping the stakes of the game. So that amplified with the attention and the awareness that's already going on, it's encouraging. But again, we have to keep leaning into this, because if there's a point of relaxation, it becomes a loss in our ability to be resilient and to continue to help our OT customers stay ahead and really get into a position of being proactive and protecting and building the confidence of the integrity of their respective environments. This has been a super opportunity. Dean, Bruce, really appreciate your time, and I look forward to continuing our conversations. And thanks to everyone who tuned in and listened for this last hour. We loved your questions. We will attempt to answer those offline afterwards, because simply you can't only get so much done in 1 hour. It's been quite a pleasure. Thank you both so much for this opportunity today.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great participation, everybody. Thank you.